Underground parking garages turned into cafeterias. Volunteer offices set up in spaces meant to park cars. Blueprints quietly rewritten mid-build. This is Ramapo, New York in 2026, the most expensive construction project in the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. And it looks nothing like what they told the rank and file it would look like. The promise was a finished campus by this year. 249 acres of sterling forest land, 10 residential buildings, broadcast studios that insiders started calling the Hollywood of the Watchtower, volunteers recruited from shuttered Bethel branches around the world, donations flowing in from every congregation on earth. Now the official deadline has been pushed to 2030, and an internal projection that leaked out of the project itself puts the real completion date at 2034. 8 years late, on a project with free labor, on land already paid for in cash, built by an organization that still tells its members it sits on billions. How does that happen? The governing body says it's the rocks, the terrain, the permits, the sewer upgrades the town of Ramapo demanded before the first residential tower could go up. And some of that is true. New York granite is unforgiving. The municipal approvals are real. But before this video is over, I'm going to show you exactly what the rocks are hiding. A single line buried in the leaked timeline that tells you what the organization is really afraid of, and why the footnote attached to it may be the most damaging admission the governing body has ever put in writing. Stay with me. Part 1. The technical facade versus the reality on the ground. When Watchtower addresses the delay publicly, the language is always engineering. Rock blasting deeper than anticipated. Excavation volumes that exceeded the original geotechnical survey. Infrastructure upgrades to local water and sewer lines demanded by the town before occupancy permits could be issued. The organization hands its members a vocabulary of complexity and expects the conversation to end there. It is the language of a problem you can measure, and it is the language of a problem that is not the real problem. Because the same organization that now pleads geological difficulty spent years telling its members that Ramapo was already under control. The land was surveyed before purchase. The topographic conditions were known. The sewer capacity of the town of Ramapo was a matter of public record the day the contracts were signed. Any construction firm with a functioning due diligence department, and Watchtower's internal construction arm has more experience than most commercial developers in the Northeast, would have priced those variables into the timeline from day one. So the engineering explanation collapses under its own weight. The question is not whether the rock is hard. The question is why an organization that has built its own branches on 5 continents suddenly pretends the difficulty of New York granite is something it never saw coming. And then there is the strategy shift underneath the construction itself. Ramapo is not just a campus. Ramapo is the physical expression of a decision the governing body quietly made more than a decade ago. The decision to pivot away from face-to-face ministry and toward centralized digital content as the primary engine of the religion. Every new video on the streaming platform, every convention drama, every children's series, every doctrinal announcement, all of it, eventually, is supposed to come out of this campus. Warwick handles administration. Patterson handles education. Ramapo was going to handle the message itself. That pivot is not cheap. It was never going to be cheap. And the early spending on Ramapo shows you that the leadership understood the cost in advance. Consider Woodgrove at Sterlington, a luxury apartment complex purchased outright by the organization to house volunteer specialists who would staff the Ramapo build. Modern construction, high-end finishes, granite countertops, fitness amenities. The kind of accommodation the governing body has, for decades, described as worldly excess when ordinary members asked why their Kingdom Hall could not be renovated. For Ramapo, the rule was rewritten without comment. The volunteers were not going to come unless the housing was solved first. So Watchtower wrote the check and solved it. That single purchase tells you everything about the original priorities. The money was there. The urgency was there. The leadership was prepared to move fast. The strategic vision was in place. And then something changed. Because by 2026, the same volunteers who were relocated into those apartments are commuting every day to a job site where progress has slowed to a crawl. Materials arrive late. Specifications are downgraded mid-build. Entire sections of the original master plan have been redesigned with cheaper finishes than the ones the governing body approved in the earliest renderings. Volunteers returning from weekend breaks describe arriving Monday morning to find that something they built the previous week has been torn out and rescoped. Acoustic panels specified for broadcast-grade sound stages have been replaced with commercial-grade equivalents. Fixtures ordered for the residential buildings have been swapped for models 2 tiers below the original specification. That is not the profile of a project running into unexpected geological complexity. That is the profile of a project whose budget is being rewritten every quarter. And budgets don't get rewritten that often unless money that was supposed to flow in is suddenly flowing somewhere else. Part 2. The financial bleeding, the weight of global scandals. While volunteers pour concrete in Ramapo, the organization's treasury is absorbing the worst legal environment it has faced in its modern history. The real reason the project has stalled is not in the rocks of New York. It is in the courtrooms of 6 countries. Start with the United States. In 2026, a new wave of federal filings directly named governing body members as defendants in abuse-related civil actions, moving past the corporate shields that had absorbed the exposure for the previous decade. The strategy of isolating legal liability inside specific Watchtower corporations, the technique that worked throughout the 2010s, the technique that kept the real decision-makers at the top of the organization personally insulated from discovery, has been breaking down state by state. Montana, Rhode Island, California. Pennsylvania's grand jury investigation, which expanded its subpoena reach again this year, despite the organization's attempts to quash it in 3 separate appellate filings. Every expansion means more document production. Every document production means more internal policy memos, the 3-witness rule correspondence, the body of elders manuals, the service department letters to branch offices, reaching plaintiffs' attorneys in other states. And every new memo becomes the evidentiary backbone of the next round of litigation somewhere else. The settlements attached to these cases are rarely public by name. Most are sealed under non-disclosure provisions, but the aggregate number is no longer small. Court filings in multiple states have confirmed that the organization's primary insurance carriers have either exhausted their policy limits or moved into coverage disputes with Watchtower itself. When an insurer exhausts its limits, the defendant pays the remainder from its own reserves. When an insurer disputes coverage, the defendant pays counsel on 2 fronts at once, one to fight the plaintiff, another to fight its own insurance company. Both of those transitions have already happened to the organization. They have been writing settlement checks out of their own pocket for years, and the pace of those checks has accelerated every year since 2022. There are also the daily fines. In several jurisdictions, the organization has accumulated court-imposed daily penalties for non-compliance with discovery orders. Orders demanding the production of internal abuse records that Watchtower has fought to keep sealed. Those fines, individually small, compound quickly. A $5,000 daily fine across a 2-year non-compliance window is nearly $4 million on a single case. And there are multiple such cases running simultaneously. Then there is Norway. The case that reached the Supreme Court of Norway in 2026 ended with the organization losing its state registration and the associated state subsidies tied to Norway's religious support framework. That is not a narrow ruling. The loss of registered religious status in a Scandinavian country creates an administrative template that other European regulators read, cite, and apply. The reasoning of the Norwegian Supreme Court, that the organization's disfellowshipping and shunning practices crossed a line into coercion that disqualified it from state recognition, is now legal precedent that plaintiffs' lawyers across Europe are quoting directly in their filings. Belgium had already moved against the organization over disfellowshipping practices. Finland opened its own proceedings. Germany, France, and the Netherlands all have active regulatory files that legal observers expect to follow the Norwegian model within the next 2 to 3 years. Every one of those losses subtracts a revenue stream the organization had previously counted as permanent. European state subsidies, historically, underwrote a significant portion of branch office operations in each country. When those subsidies end, the branches either shrink, consolidate, or close entirely, and the cost of winding them down falls back on the central organization in New York. Then there is the steady drumbeat of individual shunning cases that never make international headlines but quietly compound. The Brazilian court ruling in favor of Dr. Juliano, which established new civil liability for psychological damages caused by organizational shunning. The Victorian parliamentary inquiry in Australia, which continues to produce findings the organization must respond to in formal legal proceedings. The aftermath of the Australian Royal Commission's Case Study 29, which continues to generate civil filings nearly a decade after the hearings themselves closed. Each of these carries its own legal cost. Each of them requires defense counsel at market rates, often in multiple languages, across multiple jurisdictions, With local expertise, the organization has to hire rather than develop internally. None of that money comes out of volunteer labor. Volunteers do not argue motions in Oslo or depose expert witnesses in Melbourne. All of it comes out of cash reserves. The organization rarely admits the connection between any of this and Ramapo. The accounting is kept deliberately separate. The Worldwide Work Donation Fund, the real estate holdings, the construction budgets, and the legal defense reserves are described to the rank and file as if they were independent rivers flowing in separate directions, each one dedicated to its own sacred purpose. They are not independent. They feed each other. They draw from each other. And when one of them starts hemorrhaging, the others are forced to absorb the loss. Every dollar routed to outside counsel is a dollar that does not pay for broadcast-grade audio equipment. Every settlement wired to a plaintiff's firm is a settlement that does not become steel reinforcement in a Ramapo foundation. Every fine imposed by a European regulator is a fine that erases a material delivery the Ramapo project manager was counting on for next quarter. Every sealed payment to a survivor is cement, wiring, ductwork, or acoustic treatment that will never arrive at Sterling Forest. The foundations that are finally beginning to appear at Sterling Forest in 2026 are not the foundations of a confident, well-resourced religious corporation. They are the foundations of an organization running triage on its own budget in real time, trying to keep the appearance of momentum while the money underneath the project is being quietly redirected to keep the lawyers paid, the insurers at the table, and the regulators at bay. Part 3. The Masking Strategy, Real Estate and Volunteerism. To keep Ramapo moving at all, even at its new crawl, the organization relies on two mechanisms. Neither of them is sustainable. Both of them reveal how thin the financial margin has become. The first is the liquidation of physical property worldwide. Kingdom halls that served local congregations for 30, 40, 50 years are being sold at an accelerated pace. Circuit assembly halls in multiple countries have quietly appeared on commercial real estate listings. Entire branch offices have been consolidated or shuttered, their buildings sold, often below appraised value, because the organization needs the cash to move quickly rather than optimally. The strategy is to convert the local, physical, rooted presence of the religion into centralized capital that can be pumped into the New York campus. For members who spent decades paying off a Kingdom Hall mortgage through monthly contributions, the math is brutal. A congregation that sacrificed for a generation to own its building now meets in a rented community space an hour from home, and the proceeds from that building are being absorbed into a soundstage they will never set foot in. The elders who signed the original mortgage documents are now being asked to explain to their congregations why the building is gone and the money is never coming back. The governing body frames this as unity, as consolidation, as wise stewardship. The financial reality is that the local church is being dismantled to feed the media church, and there is a ceiling on this strategy. Watchtower can only sell each property once. The 2017 Brooklyn liquidation, the sale of the last Brooklyn Heights and Dumbo holdings that brought in more than $2 billion, was a one-time event. That windfall is gone. It paid for Warwick. It paid for the initial Ramapo land acquisition. It is not coming back. The Kingdom Hall consolidation is finite by the number of Kingdom Halls that exist. The branch closures are finite by the number of branches that exist. Once the sellable real estate is gone, it is gone. And the rate of sales over the past 3 years suggests the organization is approaching the end of that runway faster than its public statements imply. The second mechanism is volunteer labor. Unpaid, skilled, bound to the project by doctrinal loyalty rather than contract. Volunteer labor is the only reason Ramapo has not collapsed outright under construction cost inflation. Materials in the American Northeast have roughly doubled in price since the project was originally budgeted in the mid-2010s. Steel, concrete, lumber, electrical components, HVAC systems. A commercial build of this scale, on the open market, with paid union labor, would have been killed by that inflation alone 3 years ago. Watchtower has absorbed the increase because the workers do not cost anything. But free labor only solves the labor problem. It does not solve the material problem. It does not solve the permitting problem. It does not solve the cash flow problem. And it does not solve the problem of volunteer attrition, which has accelerated every year since the pandemic. The pool of qualified, skilled Bethelites willing to uproot their lives and relocate to New York for an open-ended construction project is shrinking year over year. The average age of the volunteer workforce is rising. The younger witnesses, The generation the governing body needs to carry this project across its finish line are leaving the religion at rates that internal service reports describe in increasingly alarmed language. The specialized trades required for a modern media campus, broadcast engineering, acoustic design, fiber and systems integration, high-voltage electrical, structural steel, cannot be drawn from the general witness population. Those specialists, when the organization cannot find them in-house, have to be hired at market rates, with cash the organization does not want to spend. This is the equation the governing body cannot say out loud. They need Ramapo to exist because the entire post-2010 strategy of the religion depends on it. They cannot afford for Ramapo to exist on schedule because the money is being pulled in 15 other directions at the same time. So the project creeps forward. One slab at a time. One delayed material delivery at a time. One shrinking volunteer cohort at a time. And the improvisation begins to show. Underground parking garages converted into cafeterias because the real dining halls have not been built. Finished office space carved out of corners of buildings that were supposed to serve entirely different functions. Temporary signage that has now stood in place for more than 2 years. Portable bathroom trailers that were brought in as a 6-month measure and have been on site for 3 years. Storage containers stacked alongside half-finished residential towers because the actual storage facilities are behind schedule too. Volunteers who arrived in 2022, expecting to serve 18 months on a closing build, are still there in 2026, watching the project they thought they were finishing now pushed into a timeline longer than some of their marriages. Some have left, some have been quietly reassigned. Some have stopped responding to emails from family members back home who ask when they are coming back. The organization sells its members the image of a project blessed, guided, and advancing under Jehovah's direction. The physical evidence on the ground tells a different story. One of an institution quietly improvising its way through a financial pressure it is not yet willing to name. While the people doing the work begin to notice that the story they were told no longer matches the site they walk onto every morning. Conclusion: the question Ramapo raises is not whether the campus will ever be finished. Some version of it will. The cranes will eventually stop. The sound stages will eventually hum. The ribbon will eventually be cut. And the governing body will deliver a carefully produced keynote describing the completion as proof that Jehovah always provides, always blesses the work of his organization, always delivers his people through trial. The real question is what kind of organization will be left to use the finished building. A media campus is only as valuable as the audience it reaches. The audience Ramapo was designed to serve is shrinking in every region where transparent data exists. Baptism numbers in Europe have been in decline for more than a decade. American numbers plateaued long before the pandemic and have not recovered. The rate at which second and third generation witnesses are walking away before or shortly after baptism is the highest it has ever been in the organization's modern history. The growth numbers the yearbook still publishes depend almost entirely on countries in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. Regions where the digital infrastructure Ramapo was built to serve does not yet reach the members who would theoretically consume it. Watchtower is building the most expensive broadcast facility in its history to serve a membership that is quietly eroding underneath it, in the regions where the facility's content would actually matter. That is the deeper scandal of Ramapo. Not the delays, not the improvisation, not even the quiet redirect of funds toward legal defense. The scandal is the strategic miscalculation at the center of the entire project. The organization bet its future on a centralized media hub at the exact moment its audience began walking away from the product that hub was built to produce. They bet on scale when the trend was toward fragmentation. They bet on centralization when the trend was toward personalization. They bet on a studio model built for the broadcast era, at the precise moment their remaining members were choosing platforms, voices, and sources the organization does not control. And by the time the buildings are finished, whether that is 2030 or 2034 or whatever year the internal footnote eventually settles on, that bet may already be lost. The finished campus may open to produce content for a congregation that is half the size the project was designed for. The sound stages may hum for audiences the governing body can no longer credibly claim to represent. The paper empire will have its studio, and the studio will insist on camera that everything is exactly as planned.